It was a Sunday night, August 15th, 1971. Most Americans were watching Bonanza, a Western. Fitting. Then the broadcast cut, and Richard Nixon looked into the camera. He was calm, measured. He said he was defending the dollar, protecting American workers, shielding the nation from foreign speculators attacking its currency. He used the word temporary. He said the move was temporary. That word was chosen with precision, because what Nixon announced that night was not a defense. It was a default on the explicit gold convertibility commitment the United States had made to the world 27 years earlier. And almost no one called it that. Not the press, not Congress, not the economists who understood exactly what had happened. The story was managed. The language was controlled. The panic that should have followed didn't, which was exactly the point. But consequences don't disappear because the public doesn't panic. They move underground. They compound. And 50 years later, every time your paycheck stretches a little less, every time rent rises, and your savings sit still, you are living inside the system that was born on that Sunday night. To understand what broke in 1971, you have to go back to 1944. 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Two men shaped everything: Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury's chief international economist, and John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain. They built a financial architecture for the entire post-war world. Every major currency pegged to the dollar pegged to gold. $35 per ounce. Foreign governments and central banks could convert their dollar holdings into gold on demand. That was the contract. That was the foundation. But the system contained a fatal contradiction from the start. Economists called it the Triffin Dilemma. Here is how it worked. The world needed dollars to conduct trade and hold as reserves. So the U.S. had to run deficits, continuously pumping dollars into the global economy. But the more dollars in circulation, the harder it became to honor gold convertibility at $35 an ounce. Credibility and liquidity were in permanent tension. The more the world depended on the dollar, the more fragile the dollar's gold promise became. This wasn't a flaw someone introduced later. It was wired into the architecture from the beginning. Then, Lyndon Johnson accelerated the pressure beyond what the system could absorb. He wanted two enormous things simultaneously: the Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, the war on poverty, and a land war in Vietnam. Both required money the United States didn't have. So the government printed. Persistent balance of payments deficits meant more dollars were flowing out of America than gold could back. Foreign central banks accumulated dollar reserves far exceeding U.S. gold stocks. The math had stopped working. The promise was already broken. Washington just hadn't admitted it. The fractures were becoming visible well before Nixon acted. In 1961, Western central banks formed the London Gold Pool, a coordinated effort to suppress gold prices and maintain the fiction that $35 per ounce was credible. For 7 years, they quietly sold gold into the market whenever price pressure built. It worked until it didn't. In 1968, speculative pressure overwhelmed the pool. It collapsed. The official gold price was severed from the market price. A two-tier system was created. The system was already cracking. Nixon didn't cause the failure. He administered the final acknowledgement. France accelerated the crisis publicly. Charles de Gaulle called the dollar's reserve status an exorbitant privilege and meant it. In 1965, France sent a ship to New York Harbor loaded with dollars and demanded gold in return. Not a threat, a literal redemption of the contract. Britain's sterling crisis in 1967 shook the system further. Germany faced mounting monetary pressure. Switzerland converted. By 1971, outstanding dollar claims held by foreign governments exceeded American gold reserves by a wide margin. A full redemption wave would have emptied the vault. The contract could not be honored. That was the reality Camp David was called to manage. Nixon inherited the problem, but he didn't walk into it alone. His Treasury Secretary was John Connally, a Texas Democrat turned Republican. Blunt, politically ruthless, unafraid of confrontation. Connally would later say of the dollar's reserve status, "It's our currency, but it's your problem." The man who built the technical architecture of the decision was Paul Volcker, then Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Monetary Affairs. Behind both of them sat Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, a man who saw currency and military force as instruments of the same strategy. These four men met at Camp David. No press, no Congress. They closed the gold window. So Nixon went on television and lied with confidence. He did not say foreign governments were redeeming dollars we couldn't cover. He did not say the Bretton Woods promise is broken. He said foreign speculators were attacking the dollar. He called it a defensive move. He said temporary. The Dow rose the next day, 33 points, its largest single-day gain to that point. The public didn't panic, because the public had been told a story, and the story felt reassuring. That is what managed collapse looks like. Calm on the surface, structural failure underneath. The dollar never returned to gold, not in 1972, not in 1975, not across any of the 50 years that followed. Temporary was always forever. The men in that room knew it. Here is the pattern. It is not unique to America. It is not unique to the 20th century. It is the oldest pattern in the history of governments and money. When a government is trapped by debt, it cannot repay. It does not balance the budget. It changes the rules of the money. It always chooses that. Every time. In every empire. Rome shaved its silver coins. Medieval kings clipped the edges and pocketed the difference. Weimar Germany ran the presses until the currency was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The mechanism never changes. Accumulate obligations you can't meet. Then redefine what meeting them means. The pain doesn't disappear. It gets redistributed away from the government onto the people holding the currency. That is what inflation is. Not a weather event, not bad luck. A transfer, a tax collected without a vote by people who will never appear on your ballot. The immediate aftermath gave no sign of what was coming. Nixon's approval held, markets stabilized, but without the anchor of convertibility, fiscal and monetary expansion faced no external constraint. Inflation built. By 1974, it was above 11%. Oil shocks, the collapse of wage discipline, and years of deficit spending compounded the pressure. By 1979, inflation hit 13. Paul Volcker, the man who had helped architect the transition at Camp David, was by then running the Federal Reserve. He raised interest rates to 20% to stop it. The architect of the opening move became the man who had to pay the price to stabilize what followed. Connally and Kissinger understood that gold was gone. The dollar still needed a foundation. Over the following years, Arrangements with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states ensured oil was priced and traded in dollars. Every nation that needed energy, which meant every nation, had to hold dollars to buy it. In exchange, America offered security and deep treasury markets as a store of value. Dollar dominance didn't rest on oil alone. Treasury market depth, military reach, global trade infrastructure, SWIFT. But oil was the visible architecture, and it worked. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency without a gram of gold behind it. In 1971, the national debt stood at roughly $400 billion. By 2008, it had reached $10 trillion. The response to that collapse, bailouts, emergency liquidity, quantitative easing, added trillions more. Then came 2020. $6 trillion created in a single year. The debt crossed $30 trillion, then $34. Each crisis met with the same answer: more money. Because the machine allows it. Because 1971 removed the external constraint that once forced difficult choices. What 1971 created was not automatic inflation. It created the conditions in which fiscal and monetary discipline became optional, and optional things tend, over time, not to be chosen. The consequences aren't uniform. Some nations print without immediate inflation. Demographics, deflation, and capital flows complicate the picture. The argument isn't that fiat money automatically destroys purchasing power. The argument is simpler and harder to refute. Removing convertibility constraints dramatically expanded what governments could do without immediate reckoning. The 2021 inflation surge, hitting grocery stores, rent, gas, everything, wasn't caused by 1971 alone. It was the accumulated consequence of decades of expanded monetary flexibility, accelerated by an unprecedented spending response in 2020, finally arriving in prices. The question no one in Washington will answer honestly is whether the machine has a limit. Every system before this one eventually broke. Rome ran out of silver. The British pound lost its dominance. Bretton Woods collapsed under promises that couldn't be kept. Promises that, as Triffin warned decades earlier, were structurally impossible to keep forever. The post-1971 system is now over 50 years old. It has survived every crisis by absorbing it, by printing through it. Each time the debt grows larger. Each time the next crisis requires a larger response. There is no clean historical precedent for what comes next. On August 15, 1971, the United States made a choice: short-term survival over long-term obligation, managed language over honest reckoning, changing the rules rather than living by them. The deferral felt like a solution. It always does, until the bill arrives, larger than it would have been, compounded across decades, handed to people who weren't alive when the decision was made. The dollar in your wallet is not the dollar of 1970. The promise behind it, the external anchor, the convertibility commitment ratified by 44 nations, was severed on a Sunday night by 4 men who called it temporary. They knew it wasn't. Now you do too.